You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. And welcome to episode 40 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Adam Lowenstein. Adam spent 8 years working in the American government and politics in the United States. Most recently as a speechwriter and a strategic communications advisor in the US. He is now a full-time writer, and we are here to discuss, among many other things, his book Reframe the Day, which has been out for a year or so. Adam and I are very good friends after our first conversation just under a year ago. I think it was episode 5. And ever since then, we've kept in contact and had discussions offline on many, many different things. And super excited to have Adam back on.
Thanks, On. It is great to be back on. I have loved our conversations and excited for this super episode. We'll see where we end up.
Yeah, so for everyone listening, Adam and I have been discussing this podcast for quite a few months. We've got like a full set of things that we would look to discuss, and trying to keep it down to the topics that we had was very difficult. So before we get into some of the topics, Adam, one of the things I really wanted to talk about was your book's been out now for, I think has that been over a year now?
Just over a year. It was April of 2020. Yeah,
so I would like for you just to talk about that process of having now your books out there for a year, and what the process has been like from the strict writing schedule that you had to then publishing the book and then having it out there for people to then read and give you feedback for over a year.
Yeah, and actually one of the weird ways that the book continues to reassert itself in my life is when I get Google alerts about the title, and it's, some weird PDF version of it has ended up on some strange website that's probably installing all sorts of tracking cookies and other malware on my computer. So it's a reminder when I get these random Google alerts that the book is still out there, even though I in my life have sort of moved on. Okay. But yeah, I mean, first of all, like we had a great conversation, like you said, just a little bit less than a year ago to talk about the book. And it's been, I will say, consistently a relief to have the book out there, because I think one of the things that I tried to do as I was writing it and going through the publishing process was remind myself that it's not like I published this book and then life is just peace and contentment and no stress until the end of time. It's a moving finish line, or there really is no finish line on these things. And so easier said than done. But what I tried to do is remind myself that this is going to be just one chapter of an ongoing journey. But having said that, there is a noticeable sense of contentment and stillness that I feel internally having the book out there, because so many of these ideas had been bouncing around in my head for so long that to have them just in a forum where I can say, oh, I wrote about this, or I processed this particular topic, say about the importance of mindfulness in my life, or the journey that I went on when I was pursuing a short-term career objective at all, the expense of everything else, whatever it may be. I've processed that, I've put it out into the world, and it's there. And there is a sense of peace that comes with having it out there. The book was finished in December 2019, January 2020. That's when the manuscript was finished, and it didn't come out until April 2020, which, as everyone will probably recall, that was peak chaos, peak first wave, peak lockdown. It was a strange time to be publishing and releasing a book, although in hindsight a very fortuitous one in some ways, and we can get into that. But one of the things I realized in the months between when I finished the manuscript and when the book came out was that I was failing, or at least coming up dramatically short, on living the practices that I'd written about in the book. And I wrote this new foreword that I published right around the time the book came out, saying, here's a practice on creating stillness. Here's how I failed to do that over the last few months. Here's a practice on reminding myself that in the long run, none of this really matters, and let's keep the perspective of, time and mortality in mind when we're trying to focus on the things we care most about. And here's how I was coming up short on that. And so it was a bit of a shock to the system to realize that I hadn't, even though I'd written that I hadn't finished these things, it was a bit of a shock to the system to actually experience that in person. And I think that's only continued in the year since. It's a constant struggle to remind myself, these are practices, I need to do them for the rest of my life. There's no finish line. There's no point where I will have finished meditation or finished creating a sense of awareness or finished consuming more meaningful content. So that's been the biggest thing. It's certainly a sense of peace and stillness that I have the book out there, but also a recognition that the journey continues.
Yeah, interestingly enough, what you discussed there is something I've been thinking about a lot, is the dichotomy between what you believe to be the right thing to do for yourself, then actually practicing it. Because I think anyone who, for instance, creates content, whether it be writing or videos or podcasts, it's one thing to just say that it's the right thing to do, but then it's a whole nother ballgame to just act it out and follow those practices day to day. How have you found... The reason why I think this is really important to talk about is because it goes beyond the stage of just like personal development in the sense of having habits or doing this kind of stuff. That's important, but it's more the fact of you can't do that whilst being clued in and plugged in all the time. Like you've recently just moved back to America from the UK, where you were here for I think a year or so. Is that correct, or longer?
Close to 4 years actually.
Oh, was it 4 years? Apologies. In that process, you were saying to me before we started recording, you were saying how it's been an opportunity where you haven't had a chance to write and all that kind of stuff. But that detachment perhaps can be a good thing at times because you're just focusing on other things. And I think it's the same thing with anything that you detach from, whether it's the internet, whether it's consuming content, and as opposed to creating content. And I know that was one of the subjects that we wanted to discuss.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and a lot of things that I completely agree with. I think when it comes to some of the practices in Reframe the Day, or really more broadly, like you're saying, any sort of personal development, self-improvement, or really any advice that we're giving someone else, advice that we're trying to give ourselves, I think there is a sense of accomplishment that comes from, it's like the sense of accomplishment you get when you commit to a new habit. You get all of the sense of having done, accomplished, achieved what you're planning to do without any of the actual cost of the commitment itself. And there's a bit of a new, it's like a New Year's resolution. It's a commitment high of some sort where the costs and the trade-offs and the impacts of doing something over the long term haven't really sunk in yet, but you can ride that wave of having committed yourself to doing something differently. If you say something publicly, whether it's to a friend, to a family member, just to yourself, whether you post it on the internet, you get a sense of, I don't know, it's a validation of your identity or a sense of accomplishment. If you say on the internet, I'm going to be vegan for the next 30 days, there is a sense that you've already done that. You've made that part of yourself. You have achieved it, even though you haven't actually done anything about it. And I have always felt that if I make a public statement before I've actually done something, I get some of the satisfaction of having done it without ever having taken any action. I have certainly found that with writing about self-improvement and personal development, which is that it feels like I'm making progress on it by writing about it, when in fact all I'm doing is writing about it. And so there is a gap between what I write about, and it doesn't actually impact my day-to-day life unless I then take the steps that I'm writing about. And so I've encountered this a little bit recently with this next book that I'm working on, and I've talked about the book with you, I've talked about it with a lot of people, and what I have noticed is that sometimes the more I talk about the book, that doesn't actually make any progress towards writing it. It doesn't put any words on the page, but it gives me a sense of validating my identity as a writer, as an author, as an expert on the topic. And it's a tricky balance of reconciling these two impulses. One is to keep it to yourself until you have something to present to the world, and then you miss all the opportunities for collaboration and working with other people along the way, as well as just, gaining new insights from conversation. But if you go too far the other way, you can easily find yourself just talking about something, the sort of fake it till you make it mentality that is really pervasive in, I think, obviously on social media, but also in the corporate world and a lot of professional settings as well, where at a certain point the talk almost becomes the action, and you don't realize until you go beneath the talk that there's nothing substantive there. And that may work in some contexts, but when it comes to something like personal development, eventually you have to go beneath the talk and find out if there's something there. And if there isn't, you end up in a place where you, perhaps this is where I was when the book was coming out last April, which is that realizing that, oh yeah, I still have a lot more work to do. It's not just writing about it that gets the job done, but it's writing about it and then using the clarity and understanding that I gained from writing to actually build a sustainable long-term foundation.
Yeah, I find that all the time because I read a lot and I share that and I do Q&As, and these books that I read and these things that I talk about and the difference between them being my ideas and them being someone else's ideas is very easy for someone who talks about books and ideas to assume that they're theirs to speak about. And I feel like there's even some sort of hubris to suggest that what gives you the right to share those and the right to share them with other people, because they aren't your own.
And
I don't know whether... Yeah, I don't know whether that's an internal monologue or I don't know whether that's... Yeah, I don't know whether that's just me. I'm sure it's not, because you feel the same way. But I deal with that all the time. It's like, okay, what's the percentage between me consuming, collaborating, sharing? What is just for me just to work on myself and no one needs to know about? This is why for so many years I've debated between doing a vlog and not doing one. And I'm still stuck in this position. I'm like, I really want to do one, but I really don't want to do one, because I know the process of doing so will take away time, which I know will be critical for long-term success on the things that I want to be successful in. And spending that time doing something like that will not be beneficial to me, and I know it, and that's why I don't want to do it. But at the same time, short-term mindset is thinking you need to do this because people want to know, because I get messages all the time, and dealing with that is very difficult. Dealing with that struggle is very difficult.
Do you feel a sense of obligation to your audience too, to put this out into the world, to share the ideas that you've come across? Because one of the things that I've struggled with is not assuming that once I come across an idea, that means everybody else already knows it as well.
Yes.
That there is value in, just because, you and I've talked about Cal Newport's work a lot, just because you and I are really familiar with his work doesn't mean that everybody else is as well. And there is value that we can add to the world by sharing his ideas and his books with other people. But at the same time, like you said, that can take away from your own intellectual, moral, ethical journey. And I wonder how you balance that sense of obligation to your audience, to people who depend on you and have come to rely on you, as well as your own personal individual journey.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I separate those two. So the obligation is there to the degree that the content is giving value. I would say in respect to the vlog itself, or to create more content about me and my personal, I say personal life, because it won't be like, here's what I had for breakfast, here's what I do, my
right.
morning routine, or this is my, like, it won't be anything like that. It'll be very much more about my thought process. And now I've done this for myself, but I've never really shared it. Like, I do film to camera, and this might be something that we could talk about, because we talk about journaling all the time and the power of writing it. But I almost think a video diary is really good as well, because it does track progress in the same way to journaling, but it doesn't perhaps have the labor-intensive element to it, in the sense of like writing and keeping it that way. You're just speaking to a camera, and it's almost like you're conversing with your past self, but also giving direction to your future self at the same time. So I have done that in the past, and I like the idea of a video. I like the idea of a video diary, because I always think about it in the ways, imagine if your grandchildren or future generations come across it and they can see what you were thinking. Like, I always think about that. Like, I always hear about stories about my uncles, my great uncles, my great grandfathers, and what they thought and what they did. And I'm like, imagine just being transported into India in like 1850s and then seeing my like great grandfather or something, and I'm like, I wonder what they thought. I wonder what was happening in their day to day. And I thought, well, I should really be documenting that just not for anyone now, future generations of Abdis, they'd want to know what I've done, or they might do. It might make me just being egotistical. They might not care, but it's to me it's interesting because I think people want that. So yeah, back to the point. It's like I separate like the obligation to followers in the sense that, you know, they might want to know what I do, like my processes and stuff like that. But I think for this one in particular, it's more about me as an individual. Should I just do this for the sake of doing it? Or should I do it just to build up my following and building up the, you know, the eyes on me? And at the moment, it's too much on the eyes on me and not enough on just the process of doing it. So I haven't actually done it. I'm waiting for the position to maybe perhaps when that balances out. But for me, it feels too much like, oh, you're just doing it so people can get eyes on you. And I struggle with that all the time because people might do that and think, oh, yeah, it's going to be good for me in the long term. And yes, it might be good for you long term, but currently it's not sitting well with me. Like, it's just not sitting well with me. It's like, it just doesn't feel right.
And here is the video diaries or the vlogs.
Yes. But really at a wider level, Adam, it's just anything that doesn't suit what I believe to be in my long-term interests. And I don't believe
the life of a creator presents a lot of trade-offs in that regard, because especially right now, you have to have the platform. You have to have, you know, whether it's the oft discussed, I think it's Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans, or whatever your audience may be, you have to have that to some extent. You don't have to have that to get the value out of it. Like you said, a video diary just to yourself could be all somebody needs. They don't need to publish it anywhere on the internet. But if you do want to go beyond that and try to use your platform to impact people in a positive way, to use a platform, you have to have a platform. And that requires all of these trade-offs, which I feel like are constantly in the background, especially when it comes to something like social media, where you do reach a ton of people every single day, but that puts the trade-offs like right there in front of your face, and it's
that it does.
I don't know. It seems very challenging to balance all of those things, especially for something that requires, if you want to actually do the work like you do. Yeah. It's one thing if you want to just appear to have done the work, but if you want to take the approach that you do, which is to actually do the work, to read the books, to do the writing, then that's a lot of time and a lot of trade-offs.
Yeah, my mum says that to me all the time. She's like, "This, you put so much work into it, and you put all this content out, but like she doesn't come to the position like you're not, like, she comes at it from a financial point of view, and I don't really make any really money from it. But for me, it's like, it's not about that really in the short term. Like, short term would be like, okay, how can we maximize short term financials? I think about it very much like a CEO who has a bonus structure in line with Q3's and Q4's profit like marks, and they have to reach it, otherwise they don't get their bonus. So in the short term, I'm like, okay, yeah, I might, if I get 200,000 followers, then that means I might do this and I might do that. And then I thought to myself, well, I want to be like Warren Buffett, where I make all my money after I turn 50. So that's the way that I'm trying to think about this. Is like, okay, Instagram might not be there in 5 years, but will I still be creating in 5 years? That's the way I think about it. Okay, YouTube might not be there in 20 years, but will I still be doing this in 20 years on a different platform? That's more what I'm thinking about, rather than how can I maximize my short-term, benefit now. And that's also part of the reason why I've taken up different practices, like we've been talking about. I've taken up, programming and coding and learning different languages, looking to make that into an actual career, because my goal is to really take this knowledge and take all this information and actually apply it. That's the big thing. That's the internal struggle that I have,
right?
Because it's not enough just to know it. You have to do something with it, and I fight that all the time. I deal with that. I try and deal with that the best as I can, because as anyone who loves to read and learn, the information is only as good as what you do with it.
I've already used the sugar high metaphor once, but I feel like it's appropriate here as well, which is at least I feel like I get a rush of some sort of information high when I stumble across a newsletter that I really like, and then I open up a bunch of tabs, and then before I know it, I have like 7 tabs open. I haven't actually read the newsletter, but I feel like information's all around me, and there's a rush that comes from that. And it's the same thing, I think, probably in a much more healthy and sustainable way, to walk into a bookstore. And some of that is just, bookstores are amazing places for a variety of reasons, including the history, and you can just feel the effort that went into not just creating a bookstore that's able to survive in the 21st century, but also into all of the books that are there. But you can still get caught up in just making a list of books you want to read instead of sitting down and actually reading a book.
Reading them, yeah.
And I feel like in all of these things, one of the common themes is just the process, especially for creators, but just for people in general. If you can't get value and fulfillment and find some sense of contentment and peace out of the process, then we're almost condemning ourselves to perpetual suffering, at least much more than we need to be. Because in my case, if, I knew that Reframe the Day would not become some Harry Potter-like bestseller, obviously that would have been pretty exciting, but I didn't expect that, and that didn't happen. But even so, I felt compelled to check on the progress of sales. I felt compelled to check Amazon for reviews. And I know with this next book that I'm writing, who knows what'll happen? Who knows when I'm going to get the publisher to pick it up, or which publisher that will be, if at all. Who knows how many copies it'll sell? Who knows what the reviews will be? And I'm basically condemning myself to self-imposed suffering indefinitely if I don't find some value and meaning in the process itself. And I feel like in a situation where you are of trying to balance what you're doing for short term on, or versus what you want to do for yourself over the long term, if you don't prioritize some of that individual long term stuff, and that being the process itself, what you do with the information you read, then it quickly becomes an exhausting and miserable undertaking that doesn't serve anybody, least of all yourself. But I feel like process is one of the themes here, that unless you can find sustainable ways to make the process fulfilling, then all of these things are doomed to either crush you or just sort of peter out over time. One of the things that you and I talked about a few months ago is all the different ways that you can find reasons not to start writing. And this gets into Stephen Pressfield's concept of the resistance a bit, which you and I talked about on our last podcast. But there are a lot of ways, whether it's waiting to buy a new program, a new piece of technology, we can find lots of ways to not write. And one of those for me that I'm trying to figure out where the line is when do I stop reading articles? When do I stop reading studies? When do I stop reading books? And when do I start putting my own ideas to paper? And even though I have a lot more research to do, and since we last spoke, I've completely reworked the outline, not for the first time on this book. And I suspect I will probably do that a few more times, just in writing the book proposal, which is what I'm working on now. I spent maybe 3 or 4 days at the end of May, where I was writing 3 or 4 hours a day, writing by hand, something that I know we'll get into in a bit later. And it was just a complete recharge. I just stopped whatever I was researching. I was probably halfway through an article I was highlighting one day, and the next day the first thing I did was open the notebook and start writing. And it was like I was reborn. And that was a pretty good reminder that the act of writing is the part for me that most of the clarity and fulfillment emerges from. And I'm never going to feel ready to start. I still feel like I could spend the next 3 months just reading, and that's probably true. But at a certain point, the difference between someone who just reads a lot of news articles and then someone who writes about it, I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other. They're just different. Yeah. But if I identify as a writer, if I want to try to make a living as a writer, then at a certain point, I'm going to have to stop reading articles and start writing my own. And even though I know that objectively, it's fairly obvious when you state it like that, it still requires a constant struggle to actually just sit down and start writing and start doing the work. And so I don't know, that's where I'm at right now. Let's check in in a few months and see where I'm at on see if my folder of PDFs has grown larger while the amount of words I've written has stayed exactly the same. But I feel like that's a constant struggle, is like, what is at the core, what is the work that you need to do? What's the most important thing? Start with that and then figure out everything else instead of the other way around.
Something that, in reference to what you just mentioned, is this concept of consumption of content, consumption of information, rather than the actual creative endeavor of producing something, perhaps not for the sake of sharing or for sale or even for recognition, just creating for the sake of it. Like I feel like that the act of producing something by hand, whether it be carpentry or pottery or painting or writing or these things just for the sake of it, I think are lost in today's society, but I feel like have such meaning to them. And in preparation for this conversation, I've really been very strict over the past, I want to say probably a month to 2 months, really, before I started fasting for Ramadan, was consuming content. Like, I haven't listened to a podcast in probably, before I fasted. Like, I don't really listen to anything anymore, apart from audiobooks, but that's like my thing. I can't not listen to audiobooks. That's just what I do. Right. So
I would file that under reading.
Yeah, file that one under reading. So no like radio or like really music or anything like that. And what I've found is there is a level of quietness that you get from really trying to understand why you're doing things. I think what happens sometimes, if you're constantly consuming information, whether it be from podcasts or music or whatever it might be, news or articles, like whatever it is, consumption, YouTube videos, you can go down the bottomless pit of YouTube videos. And you're just consuming noise. And I think up to a point, it just becomes noise. Like, it's just there just as just noise, and you're not really taking much in, but it's like a distraction from what you actually need to do, like you were saying. And I've really trying to be conscious not to consume for the sake of it, in respect to sacrificing anything in the long term. And one of the things I really found by doing that was you don't really have an excuse not to do anything, if that makes sense. And it's not like some toxic productivity stuff, which I know we've talked about before, the concept of toxic productivity and this urge to keep on doing things. But it's like, well, if you're not listening to a podcast and you're not reading, then what are you doing? You're just sitting there. So you might as well just go do something, if that makes sense. So it kind of, that constraint.
Or sit with your thoughts.
Or just sit with your thoughts, definitely. And I know we've talked about that interview, and I sent you that interview with Neil Gaiman. If anyone hasn't listened to it, I recommend I'll put it in the show notes, where Tim Ferriss interviews Neil Gaiman, and he talks about how he has this writing den, and he says to himself, he's like, I don't do anything in this writing den but write. He's like, I can sit there in silence, I can look out the window, I can do anything. It's either I write or do nothing. And then he says in that, he's like, after 5 minutes, you get bored of doing nothing and you just start writing. So the idea of constraints to me is a wonderfully beautiful concept, and one that I'm trying to implement into my life as much as I can. And the difficulty that I have is, obviously I create content and I put stuff on social media, but like, I've been tracking on my iPhone about how long I spend, and now it's only maybe an average of 20 minutes on Instagram a day, really, which I'm really, really proud of, because as someone who has, I don't know, at this point 140,000 followers, you probably think I spend the whole day on it. But my goal is not to be a Instagram influencer. So why should I spend all my time on Instagram? It's not a goal of mine. It's never been a goal of mine. And I think, going back to this topic, it's like, what's a goal that you want, but what's what others expect of you? It's like, just because you have 140,000 followers, why do I have to assume that position, which is self-imposed, because no one's telling you to do that. You're like, well, I should be fitting up to a person like that. It's like, no, get rid of that. You don't have to be doing anything. You can do what you want. You can choose to do what you want with your time. So yeah, that's something I've been thinking about recently.
The fact that you're only spending, say, 20 or 25 minutes a day on Instagram, even if you weren't building a brand, building a platform, building a community, really, I think is pretty amazing for most people to hear right now. And the fact that you're only spending that amount of time while also getting up to 140,000 followers by building this network completely explodes the myth that you have to spend hours and hours of your life on these platforms to be successful, to not have FOMO, to do any of the things that the platforms, that these companies try to convince us that we need to do to be successful or plugged in, or even to get the benefits of them. Like, you found a way to get the benefit of this service without, or at least with the minimal amount of cost to your time and attention, as well as what your engagement feeds into their
I will
algorithms.
caveat this though, Adam, in the sense that this is now, not previously, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think
So,
that's almost more impressive. I think in some ways is that you have resisted the pull of the the surveillance capitalist platform, or platform again gives them too much credit, because it's obviously not just a platform. It's a very ingenious device for stealing our time and attention and behavioral data and everything. But I think the fact that you have gotten to this point and made it work for you, I think there's a lot there that a lot of us can learn from that. And that's not just about social media, that's about anything that takes our time and attention. But anyways, I think that
I think the platform is irrelevant at this point. I think the platform is irrelevant. I think it doesn't matter what it is. Like you said, anything that steals your time and attention.
Yeah. So one quote that popped into mind, because I was looking back through a book that I think we talked about on the last podcast, because I just read it shortly before we talked, which was Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows, which came out in
to read it.
2010. And I hadn't heard about it until last year. It was, I think, a Pulitzer finalist, but it's all about what you and I are talking about and have talked about before, which is the role that the internet plays in not just shaping our experience of the world, but actually altering the chemistry and I don't even know what it's called, but the neurons and the neural pathways in our brains. Like, it physically alters our brains because of what we choose to spend our time doing. And I wrote down this quote because I thought it might come up, which was...
Okay, go on.
So again, this is in 2010, so just multiply everything he's saying by, I don't know, a factor of 100, but he's like, my brain was hungry. It was demanding to be fed the way the net, that's how you know it's from 2010, because he calls it the net, fed it. And the more it was fed, the hungrier it became. So to your point just a few minutes ago about how you get this sense of quiet when you are able to block all of that out, it just, like you said, like the more that you consume, the more you need to consume. It becomes, there's no end to it. It's the infinite scroll. It is never ending, and it changes what you crave, and it changes how you see the world. So I would definitely, I know.
Yeah, I need to read that. But one of the authors I spoke to just before this podcast, I did a podcast for this about an hour and a half ago, and she had this great analogy called the hungry ghost, because the hungry ghost continues to feed itself, but it's never satisfied because the ghost doesn't have a belly. Like, it just goes through them. So you're just constantly consuming, but then there's no substance to it, essentially. You're just consuming it. You're like, oh, I'm getting the feeling of consuming and eating, but nothing's actually sitting and nothing's being transferred.
Oh, I like that. The hungry ghost.
The hungry ghost. Yeah, I like that. She had some really good ones, actually. She also said, in reference to someone who's like being quite lackadaisical or just moving slowly towards something that's inevitably going to be bad for them, she said, they're cruising for bruising. And I'm like, I love that. They're cruising for bruising.
So let me ask you a question then about this, because one of the things that you and I had talked about, I think the last time we spoke, and I should stop referencing that because we weren't recording that, so that was not as much of interest to other folks who are listening or watching this, but was this idea of how do you decide what content to consume, how do you decide what to let go? And I feel like it would be interesting for people to hear some specifics about what you've done over the last few months to get that sense of mental quietness, and to, you mentioned not really listening to podcasts, which I feel like for a lot of people, myself included, is I know it is theoretically possible not to always have a list of like 100 podcasts waiting to be consumed. But just because it's theoretically possible doesn't mean I'm actually going to let myself do that. So
Sure.
I feel like that would be interesting for folks to hear.
I just wrote it down on a piece of paper. I'm like, okay, what practices do I do? And I did this as a framework of learning, because everything that I really do, and this is maybe something you want to get into, but everything that I really do is through that framework. Like, what value am I getting? What learnings am I getting from it? And it might not be like immediate, but like it's just a sense of learning from it, and making me a quote unquote better person, not from a morally or ethically point of view, but it's contributing to my self betterment, whether it be learning or physical exercise, whatever it might be. So for this one in particular, I thought to myself, okay, I'm listening to podcasts, and it might be, let's say, an hour and a half or 2 hours a day. And I'm like, okay, I'm listening to these podcasts, but what is these podcasts taking away from me? Okay, could I use that an hour and a half or 2 hours to listen to an audiobook? Could I use that an hour or 2 hours to perhaps just half that and just actually read a normal book, instead of just half listening to a podcast, which is actually I can't really do when I'm working because it's distracting me from when I'm working, and I can't do it when I'm not doing anything, so I might as well just read a book anyway. So I thought to myself, well, I could just cut this in half and get double the value, because I know in reading, I know one of the books we wanted to talk about today was Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. I have an interesting story about that, but I will get to that in a second, which
Excellent.
just happened
Put a pin
earlier.
in that one.
Yeah, we'll put a pin in that one. Is I know a 15 minutes of reading that book will be better for me than any podcast I've listened to. And that's a personal thing. I'm not saying that that's for everyone. I know I've found my medium for learning. I found it. Like I shouldn't have to keep on looking. I feel like the benefit that I get from reading, whether they be audiobooks or physical books, outweighs any other form of medium, whether it be articles, news, podcasts. I've tried it, I've done it, but books supersede it for me. So I'm like, why don't I just double down on the thing that I know works for me? So that's why I'm only focusing on audiobooks or books. Like Adam, I don't really like to talk about how many books I read, because I feel like then it comes a conversation about how much are you retaining from it. And I'm like, that's why I don't tend to talk about how many books I read now. I did in the past, but I don't do now. I think in the last month and a half, I must have read probably close to 13 or 14, because I'm spending double, and I was spending a lot of time before relative to the mass market reading, because I create content, but I've doubled down on how much I'm reading, which for anyone might be thinking, well, you read more than anyone else, and now you're reading more than any, and to me it's because I feel like I've found what's mine. How to decipher that is really simple.
Let me just say,
like
I wrote that down. I found my medium for learning, what you said just a minute ago, because I think that says it all. And oftentimes it's just right there in front of us, and we just choose not to see it for whatever reason. And the obvious thing is that books are your medium, and so why would you replace that with anything else?
Like in reference to, let's say, programming, which I'm learning now, is like I can watch a YouTube tutorial, but I know that a book's going to be better for me. So why even go down the rabbit hole of YouTube where I get distracted and I might watch something else for like half an hour? Or it goes back to our previous point where you might watch a tutorial, but that's not actually doing it. Watching a tutorial gets you the feeling that you're doing it because you're watching it and you think that it's you. You think it's you that's doing it because someone's doing it, but you're just watching it as if you're just a bystander. You might as well just turn it off and then go do it yourself. So that's what I feel like with actual reading. Like that's why I bought books on programming, on HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Like that's why I bought the book, because I know that works for me. I know that listening to a podcast or watching a YouTube video or reading an article is just not the same thing. It's just not. And like there was a quote in Amusing Ourselves to Death, and I want to see if I can get it up. I made a note of it towards the end, but it was something in respect to, and I thought about book summaries, because book summaries are like a big thing at the moment, whether they be blink lists or whatever it might be. And it says here, bits of information cannot be integrated into an intelligent or consistent whole. So you can't just pass out bits of intelligent information and just try and glue it together yourself. You have to
Right.
consume everything in context in order to try and get the whole picture. And that's what I want to do. I don't want to be one of those people that passes through information from different sources and makes my own idea of what it is, because it's very rarely going to be what it actually is.
Yeah, I think about that with when I hear ads for, ironically, of course, podcasts for Blinkist all the time, which is that may be a valuable service, but it's not reading. And there is no hack to reading other than just sitting down with a book and spending hours and hours doing it. There's no, like, whatever, speed reading or listening to an audiobook on triple speed, or there's no way to hack the process. It is what it is. And if you want the benefits of it, at least the benefits that you and I experience, because like you said, we've found our medium, then you just have to sit down and do it and prioritize it. And it's a constant struggle. And one of the things, to your point about, the programming tutorial or the coding tutorial versus actually coding, my thing is, like, I will read book reviews until the end of time. I will read end of the year book lists and make lists of books that I want to read. I will do that forever unless I catch myself and stop and actually just start reading one of those books. It's the same thing with listening to podcasts with authors who have new books out. And obviously I've benefited a lot from that as an author. That's how we connected. There's a lot of good in the world to be done by people hearing these conversations. But at the end of the day, it all takes the place of reading. And it is a constant struggle to just keep coming back to that fundamental point, because it's really pretty straightforward. It's like, it's right there. And it's been there for centuries. It's just up to us whether we make that choice.
And it feels weird saying that, considering this is going to be on a podcast and people are going to listen to it. They might be thinking,
recognize all the hypocrisies and ironies of
the hypocrisy feels very big at the moment, Adam. But I feel like this is for anyone listening to this, even for myself, really. It's more the fact that it's not telling you not to do it. It's more find the medium that works for you.
Yes.
That's really the underlying message. It's not saying you don't listen to podcasts. It's not saying only read books. It's like, try and find the medium that works for you. Like, my family don't like to read. They can't read. They can read, but they learn by listening and watching videos. They don't learn by reading like I do. And it's been a massive revelation for me, Adam, in the past couple of months. Because I'm like, I knew I liked reading. Like, I knew that I dedicate a lot of time to it and I share that information. But it's like gone to a stage where it's gone from liking and me doing it to being like, okay, this is like, to what James Clear talks about in Atomic Habits. It's like, that's my identity now. Like, it's gone to a stage now where it's like, now it's like, when I have 5 minutes, it's not I go to my phone. It's like I pick up Will Storr's new book and read a couple of pages and then put it down. I'm like, I just want more people to get to that stage, because I know the value that gives me, and that's why I feel like I should be sharing it. Going back to the vlog thing, it's like I feel like people should know that, but I'm like, if I share that with someone, that takes time away from me, and you'll just have to balance those two.
Yep, constant trade-offs. But so it's been a couple months now since you turned up the dial on focusing on reading at all costs. That makes it sound kind of apocalyptic, but where you've substituted more reading for things that used to take some of your time.
Yes.
But, so one of the things I find when I am deep into a reading cycle, which, might be on vacation or something like that, or at least traditionally, that's, I think, a place a lot of people find or make the time to read is on vacation.
Yeah.
And I find that I see the world differently, and little things that I would stress out about under normal circumstances just don't rise to the level of care or concern or even consciousness. And so I wonder, now that you're a couple months into doing this kind of full time, if things like, day-to-day news, who said what to who on what show, or which politician did this or that, which ultimately in the grand scheme of things is meaningless. Not to say that politics or news are meaningless, but a lot of the stuff that we think of as news is. And I say that coming from a world of politics.
I mean, you're the best person to say that, Adam.
I wonder if that's fades to the background more for you.
Well, let me reference that two ways in the fact that I don't really watch the news, so I that wouldn't come into my mind in the sense of what someone said to that, because I don't really have a look at that.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like I haven't always been like that, but ever since reading more, I've always been like that, where the trivial things don't come in, because you get a wider perspective, whether it be from philosophy. And I want to caveat this in saying, when I've been reading more widely the last couple of months, it hasn't just been non-fiction, self-development. It's been history, it's been politics, it's been fiction, it's been like contemporary journalism. I've just tried to go wide. I've just trying to go wide. Like on this podcast, I've had a couple of historians on. Like I had Richard Crowley on the other day. He talks about the siege of Constantinople in 1453. I had Violet Moller on. She wrote a great book called The Map of Knowledge. So it tracks 7 cities and their impact in history and how knowledge transferred through them. Alexandria, Baghdad, Palermo, Salerno, Venice. Like I've had Andrew on to talk about Caravaggio, and he's coming back on to talk about the Sistine Chapel. I'm like, this is my thing. Like, this is my thing. And I'm like, I found it. Why am I looking anywhere else? And so to answer your question, it's like, it drowns out everything else, because I'm like, well, if this gives me so much fulfillment and this gives me so much knowledge and I can share that, why should I get worried about what Boris says about Nick Cummins or whatever, Dominic Cummings, whatever his name is? I don't care at this point. Like, why should I care what those guys are doing in number 10? Why should I care about like anything, insert anything else? And that's not me coming from a selfish point of view, because I'm very family orientated. So if anything's happening in my family or in the wider community, whether it's my extended family, like I'm very like attuned to it. But outside of that, outside of my sphere of control, I'm like, not really much I can do about it. Like I'll post in social media if there's anything like what happened in between Palestine and Israel. Like I'll post some stuff about that. But apart from that, Adam, I try and keep it as low-key as possible, because you just have to look into history of individuals, whether they be Marcus Aurelius from Stoic philosophy, or in Islam you have some figures like Imam Ali who were really just recluses, but not recluses in the sense of that they were reclusive from their communities. It's they found the value in being a recluse to the degree that it gives you space to think. Like the Prophet had his revelation when he was in the cave. He spent 40 days in the cave. And that's not a coincidence. That's not just a coincidence that you have revelation during time of when you're not seeing anyone else. And I know obviously you can't do that in today's environment unless you want to go live in the woods, which that would be amazing. But it's one of those things where
find solitude.
You definitely can find solitude.
You can create solitude.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. You can still create solitude in today's environment. You just have to switch off devices and divisive people. Not just the device itself, but the divisive people. Because perhaps it's not the device itself, it's who you're attuning yourself to. So, to reference your question, I know I did a bit of roundabout there, was I've found my level of mental clarity has moved. I've always been a long-term thinker, but now it's gone from like thinking 20 years to thinking like 40. And I'm like, okay, this is starting to be in a position where I'm getting a bit more content.
There's so much to that. And before we keep going, 2 things come to mind. One is when we're thinking about people who have an impact on the world, and a lot of times the impact does not come with fame or notoriety or renown, but impact, like you said, impact on your family, impact on your immediate community. The things that you control are often just how you show up for people around you.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
That has a huge impact. And obviously there is a trade-off between time spent indulging in whatever on social media and time spent engaging and being present for people around you. But I think even if you think about, historical figures who have had an impact on the world, they are using the time and energy and attention that they have, not getting caught up in the little stuff, to focus on the big stuff. And when I think about self-improvement in the context of, and I think you and I had spoken about this before, but in the context of, say, the 2020 presidential election in the US, I could get the fleeting satisfaction and righteousness of posting on Twitter or social media about my thoughts or feelings. Or I can put the phone down and I can go out and volunteer for a campaign or a candidate and knock on doors and help get out the vote or donate money. Like, there are a lot of tangible things I can do that actually do add value to the world and are not just me indulging my own biases on social media or something. And I feel like there is this false narrative that if you're not on, again, I keep coming back to social media, it's obviously much broader than that. And this is very much true in the DC political world too. There's this narrative that if you're not engaging, if you're not on social media, if you're not aware of what this talk show host said to this politician last weekend, then you're somehow missing out. But the people who are out doing stuff, the people we are talking about, are not paying attention to that stuff. They're the ones who are out there doing the work, doing the reading. And so I feel like there is this notion that we miss out when we give up on whatever is distracting us. And I think that it's a misleading notion that ends up with a lot of us, myself included, just being totally overwhelmed by content and things we want to consume, while the people who are going out and doing the things we want to be doing are not paying attention to that stuff. When we were talking about finding your medium for learning, I think it's important for folks to recognize that what we're talking about, and this, I'm saying this as much to myself as anybody else, is that This is it's not easy. It doesn't mean that you don't feel the pull of a podcast you used to listen to or an email newsletter. Like, this stuff, and this is something I'm still trying to recognize and reckon with, which is that giving up content that I want to consume, let's say let me be more specific. There's a ton of Substack newsletters out there right now. A lot of journalists who I really respect and admire are on Substack. You're on Substack. When I reboot my newsletter, Reframe Your Inbox, in a few weeks, I'm going to be on Substack. But there is simply no way for me to do anything else but read Substack newsletters unless I stop consuming content that I find interesting on them. So I used to have this idea that all I need to do is eliminate the stuff that I don't really care about and then focus on the things that I care about. And what I've had to come to terms with is that I also have to eliminate things I care about. I can't just read, or I can't just give up stuff that doesn't matter. I have to give up stuff that matters to focus on other stuff that matters. And this whole idea, which I've started to think of as like content minimalism, it's not easy. And obviously there's a larger discussion that comes out of this, which is about the trade-offs in life in general, not just consuming media and content. But I think for the purposes of this discussion, that's a pretty good way to think about it, which is that you have to give up stuff that you like and enjoy and get value from. It's not just giving up the stuff you don't care about. And that, again, like a lot of things we're talking about, easier said than done. But I think that's been a bit of a mental breakthrough for me over the last 6-12 months, is beginning to accept that and unsubscribing from things that I like, not just unsubscribing from things I don't like.
Yeah, because if you think about it ordinarily, you'd think, oh, someone's listened to a podcast by two authors. You're like, well, that's a great thing to do. That's better than sitting watching Netflix. But it's like, well, yes, that's the first step. But then it's a transition, isn't it? Like you said, anyone's making that change. Don't go cold turkey, because there's no point. You'll just go back. But as you make incremental changes, you'll be like, well, I'm finding more value doing something else. I really like it, but it's still taking time away. And it might even give you value. Like watching a YouTube tutorial on how to code is, you're learning, you will learn something, but you won't learn as much as if you did it. So it's like, just because something is beneficial and it's giving you value still doesn't mean, and this is the really difficult thing. And like you said, this is where it takes a lot of resolve and discipline. It's like, even if you find value in it and you enjoy it, you still have to get rid of it. And that's so difficult. It's so difficult.
Well said. I like that. That pretty much sums up everything we've been talking about.
Yeah,
Which
for the first part. And so as we transition, I wanted to talk about Neil Postman's book, but let me quickly give you the story that we pinned. So I had a podcast earlier with Fiona Buckland, who's a coach, and she wrote a book on thoughtful leadership. And she would basically, halfway through the conversation, I asked her about values, how someone goes creating their values if they don't have their own value structure. And she's like, well, let me do the exercise with you. So she sort of asked me some questions, and we did a session as if she was coaching me. And I started saying how I like creating content, like learning from these books and sharing with others, and it's about education, it's about sharing. And then I gave the example about Neil Postman's book. So I started talking about it, saying this book came out in the mid-1980s. It talks about Orwell versus Huxley, and it's very, very contemporary to the issues that we're struggling with now. It gives great context into what's happening in America right now with its divisive politics and everything that's going on, and it's very relevant. So everyone should read it, and that's why I feel like I should share it. And then she turns around, she's like, I knew Neil Postman. I'm like, what?
Wow.
She's like, yeah. She's like, her husband was a student under him at NYU. So they went on road trips together. She went to go watch him talk and watch him to go speak. And I was just like, this is amazing. Like, what a small world. For the last 3 days, all
incredible.
I've done in the last 3 days is think about this book and reread it in preparation for the conversation. And I told my mum this, by the way, before we spoke, and she was like, I'm not big on this whole like affirmation stuff where like willing things into existence. But I did take a moment to think about this, and I thought it's maybe a bit too much of a coincidence, that one.
That is wild. And also, there's something about that I feel like we often think of the past as something separate from where we are right now. And obviously in terms of time, that's true. But the past is often not that far from where we are. And this is something that I think actually both of our countries, the US and the UK, have been very good at telling ourselves narratives of we made mistakes then as a nation, but that was then, we've made progress, and now we're better. And I feel like a little anecdote like this, like you're 1 degree of separation from Neil Postman.
Crazy.
We are not that far off from the history and the mistakes, as well as the successes that we as societies, communities have made, as we like to think we are.
Yes.
And in addition to the fact that the timing is just like pretty eerie and wild, that not only did she know Neil Postman, but you've just been reading this book, but it's a pretty good reminder that like this was a real guy who was very prescient then, and that wasn't a separate time. That was just like, well, I guess at this point 25, 26 years ago when he published that book, and that is not that long, and that's not that far off from where we are right now, and there's a lot to that.
I was wild, Adam. I was shocked. I would love to see my face when she mentioned that again, because I did obviously see my face, but I'd love to see my face. I'm looking forward to watch that one back. But I really thought to myself, I'm like, very much similar to your sentiments there about time, and like I've been reading a lot of history as well. So like I've been reading about 1400s and 500 the years in between that, specifically the Ottoman and Byzantine, and I'm like, it's so medieval in the way that they conducted everything. But then I thought to myself, it's like 1500 years ago. It's not that long.
Yeah.
Like it's
certainly
not
in
really
the span
that
of human
long
history,
ago.
It is not that long. Certainly
It isn't.
Span of evolution, it is less than a blink of an eye.
I mean, how many people removed are we from 1500 years ago? I don't know. But maybe 100, just over 100. Probably a bit more, but it's not that many.
Yeah,
it's not that
and
many
also, how
to
much do we remember? Obviously, there weren't that many ways of preserving that world then as there are now. But if we think about what the world is going to be like 500 years or 1500 years from now, who knows what, if anything, that we are talking about, writing, reading, will be remembered. And that can sound really depressing to people, but I find it incredibly liberating to think about the world that way. Because then you can just give up on all the stuff that you don't care about, and that doesn't matter. It's not as easy as doing that, obviously, but it's it's a helpful mental exercise for putting the little meaningless stuff that we stress out about so much in perspective, when we remind ourselves that a couple hundred years from now, certainly 1,000 years from now, who knows if the planet will still be around at that point. But assuming it is, this stuff is not going to stick around. So really all we have to do is just show up for people and for ourselves right now. Like, that's the only thing that's really worth doing at the end of the day. And obviously stuff is a lot more complicated like that, than that in real life, but it's a pretty helpful mental exercise, I think, to think about sometimes.
It definitely is, especially in relation to the Violet Muller book I told you about the map of knowledge, where she talks about how knowledge gets transferred. And I definitely recommend it that you read it. It's a really, really good book. And for anyone listening to this, I can't wait to share the podcast. She's amazing. And she was talking about the Library of Alexandria and how they accumulated all that information. It became the center of scholarly research, and everyone wanted to travel there to learn. But then it became abandoned, and then the book, because it was made on papyrus paper, and it basically just wilts into dust. And then now there's a fragment, like no one really knows. I mean, they've built a library on top of it, but that's more symbolic. But back then people thought, this is going to be around forever. And these scrolls, people are going to read these scrolls for thousands of years to come. It's like, there's like nothing left of it. It's just dust. It's all dust. And I thought about that, and I think about that all the time. And I think about the despots, the dictators. I think about all these types of people, these people that are saying, this is the way you should do it. This is the way you should do it. My way is the best way to do it. Vote for me. Do this, do that. And I'm like, does it really matter? At the end of the day, it's like, can't we just, not in like a really corny way, but can't we just coexist in a way that is beneficial for all? Because we're not going to be around forever. So let's just make it the best it can be. And that sounds really corny.
Yeah, but sometimes things are corny or cliche only because we've heard them so many times. It doesn't negate the underlying point, I don't think.
True.
So
anyway,
and
this book,
the thing about the papyrus makes me think of this notion that we often have of history was what happened. We have an objective understanding of what was then, and now we just look back on it and understand this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened, which is obviously a false narrative on a lot of levels, because history is written by people who have a story to tell, for better or for worse, oftentimes for worse. But it's amazing how much of our understanding of the past is determined by what just happened to survive. Like, written traditions are much more thoroughly preserved than oral traditions for obvious reasons. But even among a written set of history, like I think we've talked about Marcus Aurelius earlier in this conversation, and the little bits that we have that have become his meditations or his other writings are only because those little scraps of paper happen to stick around and be rediscovered a couple centuries later. There's so much we don't know. There's so many stories that haven't been told. And it's a very obvious point in a lot of ways, but it's amazing how much of our understanding of history is A, written by people who have a specific narrative they want to tell, and B, we know just because a handful of letters that a certain person exchanged with somebody else happen to be preserved. And that's what we draw our understanding from. Or we happen to stumble across a scroll from 1,000 years ago that somehow managed not to disintegrate with time. And again, dramatically oversimplifying the reality here, but I think there is a lot to be said for questioning the narratives that we as individuals or as societies have, not just because of who was writing the history, but also what by pure fortune or misfortune or happenstance happened to be saved and what did not.
Yeah. I always think about that from history in the sense of context, because it's like history isn't just memory. Like when you read a history book, it's not that happened, that happened, that happened in a sequential view, because whoever's writing that account of history, there might be 3 accounts and they might all be different.
Right.
So it's like, okay, how do you? And I was talking to this about Roger Crowley about Constantinople, because at points he was saying there was multiple accounts, all detailing the same event, all different. And I'm like, well, as the historian, how do you pass out what to write? He's like, there just has to be intellectual integrity, and you have to make a decision, or you just be honest and say, look, these are the accounts, this is what this is saying, this is what that's saying, this is who this person was, he sat on that side, they sat on that side. So you have to have obviously some objectivity to it. You don't want to just say something for the sake of it because you believe it to be true, because that, I think, just goes against the integrity of being a writer, or being someone who shares knowledge. It's like you have to have integrity behind it, and to share that information. So yeah, definitely. And that's why I love history, to be fair. I think understanding your roots as an individual give context to how you act in the present, because it gives you a place, like it gives you a reason, it gives you a motive to understand that it's finite. Everything that you do is finite. The pain, the joy, everything, because you might read about, for instance, I'm listening to an audiobook on Genghis Khan, and you're like, yeah, he might have done all this stuff, but no one knows where he's buried. No one goes about their day to day searching around on Instagram and in the office and be like, oh, Genghis Khan was a great leader, wasn't he? Like, no one knows. Like, no one really cares. But back then he was like, oh, Genghis Khan, he was like the guy, you know. I just think about that all the time, because throughout history there's been individuals that have been lauded as being, and they even claim to be divine leaders, where they've been given, you know, divine power to lead, and no one remembers them. I think about that all the time when I think about individuals.
It'd be a helpful lesson for some of our aspiring autocrats today to consider that their craving for notoriety and status and control and divinity will be ultimately just as forgotten as the previous generation and the generation before that. These strongman leaders come and go despite their best efforts to preserve themselves for eternity.
I think about like the Qin dynasty in China. When I visited China, I went to Xi'an, and I went to go see the Terracotta Army. Amazing. Like you go there and you're like, this is history. There is no way of getting around seeing thousands upon thousands of individually marked terracotta warriors, like based on real individuals. So they molded it for the actual army, and each one's inscribed with their own personalized hand marks. Thousands buried underground in order, untouched. Like there's no getting around the fact that that's history. But then the fact that emperor didn't want to have any recollection of history prior to him, or to know that what came before him. So he made all the people who made those go into a mound and then shut it off. So they all got buried alive. And he had the practice of drinking mercury because he thought it was good for him, so he died of mercury poisoning. And there's thousands of stories like that through history. And the more I come across it, I'm like, and I think about this personally, by the way. I'm not saying, pointing the finger at X individual for chasing stuff. I'm like, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? Because, and it's not in the nihilistic sense that it's going to be meaningless, but it's like, is that what's really important? Chasing that position, getting the thing that I think is going to make me happy or successful, or am I just doing it because I want people to think that I'm so wonderful?
Right. Or because it's much easier to project an idea of yourself in the future and spend all of your time and effort chasing that rather than confronting the reality that's right in front of you, which again, like a lot of the things we're saying can sound very nihilistic and depressing, but it can, if you choose to see it, if you reframe it, you might say, if you choose to see it differently, then it can be very liberating and very clarifying. And I feel like that is the underlying message of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here, which is that different things, depending on how you choose to interpret them and choose to understand them, can be very helpful reminders or just very depressing and morbid. But that choice is ultimately on us. And a lot of the people who we are talking about, whose ideas have stuck around for, a generation or two or longer, are the people who have recognized that reality and not gotten distracted by the chase, but instead focused on doing the work and focused on what they can control. And
it's not even generations,
kind of on us
Adam.
if we want to choose.
Sorry to interrupt, but what I'm saying is not even generations, it's thousands of years. And this is why, I've been spending a lot of time reading, especially old works of philosophy and history. It's well, it seems to be, if an idea is stuck around for 1,500 years and people are still talking about it, probably some truth in it. So why am I reading a book that's just come out? Because there's no validity to that. Just because it's come out doesn't mean it's better than something that's come out. The fact, at least you got 1,500 years of proof to know that it's a good idea, because if it wasn't for 1,500 years, it wouldn't have been around. There's obviously some truth in it. Or
at least worth exploring.
At the very least. At least we even putting it on your Amazon list, at least.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Speaking of ways that I spend time reading about books rather than actually reading books, the to-read list is a perfect example of it. It grows longer and longer as I spend more and more time writing down the books I want to read instead of just sitting down and reading a book.
I've stopped doing it at this point.
I think that's a good call.
I've stopped. I'm like, why am I collating a list of books? So it got to this. Shall I tell you when I stopped doing it? So let's talk about this point and then move over to Neil Postman's book, because I know you read it recently and I would love to get your thoughts on it. But I recently what I used to do is sort of add it to my save later on Amazon. I was going through my save later the other day. I was just flicking through it to see what books I had on it. And at multiple points in time, I must have clicked the same book that I wanted, because I had 8 copies of the same book. And I'm like, wait, I wouldn't have ordered 8 copies of the same book. I must have gone through here and clicked on this book the same 8 different times to add it to my list. And I'm like, wait, if I've gone to the effort of clicking 8 times to have it on my list and I still haven't got it, there's something wrong in the system. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. What is going on here? And I just stopped at that point. I was like, this is useless. This is completely futile. If I was going to buy a book, I would have bought it.
So that's how you interpret that, is because I feel like there are 2 ways you could go. One is that I clearly need to read this book because I've added it to my list 8 times. But the other is I clearly don't need to read this book because I've added it to my list 8 times and I still haven't prioritized reading it. So which one do you or
I kind of thought a bit higher than that. I thought about higher than that. I thought, why am I searching, or why am I collating this list if the purpose of collating that list is to buy books and read them? If I'm not using that list in order to buy books and read them, there's something wrong with the system. And I know we wanted to talk about systems and creating personal systems, but the system's not working. And I probably bought loads of books just the first time. I'm like, that sounds really interesting. I'm going to buy that. And I bought it straight away. And you could have perhaps thought about, maybe it's the individual book, maybe you're just not interested in the topic or whatever. But I kind of just went a bit higher level, like I kind of always do. I kind of employed the Toyota system of the 5 whys. And I kind of thought, well, why am I doing this? Because I want to read books. Why do you want to read books? Because you want to learn. I'm like, well, if I'm not learning from the things that I want to learn from, which is books, then why am I using the system? It's completely futile. So then I stopped doing it. It's pointless.
That makes me think of the beauty of the bookstore and using going to the bookstore as a way of choosing what you want to read next, because I've been on a bit of a I don't know, I was all ebook for years and years and years, and only the last couple of years, in part based on some of our conversations and some other stuff we can get into about a craving for analog that I have developed recently. But I've been pivoting back towards good old-fashioned print books. And with that, I've been, as COVID has allowed, I've been going back into bookstores too. And there's the number of books that I have just picked up over the last 6 months in between various lockdowns, of going to a bookstore and just seeing that and being like, oh yeah, I wanted to read that. Or, oh yeah, I heard about this author, let me start flipping through it. And then all of a sudden I discovered that this is exactly what I needed to read, even though there's no way any algorithm was going to deliver it to me. There's no way, even maybe if I had it on my Amazon list from a year ago, I was never going to go back to that point on the list. And so it's just another ringing endorsement for the good old-fashioned bookstore, and just the happenstance, the random chance of bumping into a certain book or a certain author when you're just browsing around. And I feel like going to a bookstore just blows up whatever electronic list one might have, because it immediately supersedes that, because it becomes real and tangible. And I don't know, there's a lot to be said for print books and a lot to be said for bookstores on their own merits, but I feel like finding some substance in an era of digital electronic nothingness, or infinity, or not even nothingness, more like everythingness, is a pretty strong endorsement.
Definitely. I mean, I obviously advocate for bookstores. A good transition, actually, because Neil Postman's book I found in a bookstore in London, browsing. And I had another author on the other day. His name was Adam as well, actually. And we were talking about Neil Postman's book. And he had this really fancy cover. And I was like really red. It's like a red colour. It had some graphics on it. And I was like, that's a nice cover. And I've got the most dreary British looking cover you could probably guess, just grey. And if there's anything to, now, living in the UK for 4 years, if there was anything to define the UK, it's probably grey, weather and otherwise. So let's talk about this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. I've read it. I read it probably a year and a half ago, the first time, and I've been speaking about it quite often since then, because I read it and it was one of those books where I thought, wow, how was he able to pick up on this in the mid 1980s and just know? Sometimes you just read people and they just knew, and he just knows. He just knows the current climate, and he was able to, I don't want to say predict, because I don't think he was really predicting in the book. I don't think he was saying this is what's going to happen. He was more saying this is the inevitability of it, and this is what it is, and it's up to us to change that fate. So talk to me, because you have read this book recently. So I'd love to know your first thoughts on it, and what your thoughts were about it.
I feel like a good place to start here for folks who are not familiar with Postman would just be a quick overview of, I actually don't know a lot more about his career other than this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I think folks should know is, they may have heard of the book, or they may have heard of it referenced in a lot of the ongoing conversation today, whether it's about social media, about how the medium through which we consume information changes how we understand the world, changes how we see or understand what truth is or is not. I think Postman is someone who, Cal Newport, who you and I have talked about a lot and who we admire, someone who Newport writes about a lot. And I don't know, before we get into some of the ideas, do you want to mention anything about his career or trajectory, or should we just get right into the content?
He was a professor of communications and arts at New York University, and he was one who went around the world and talked about these things, very similar to, I would actually consider him probably to be one of the pioneers of the idea of writing contextually to the time and then speaking about it, and being a professor, with the common, now you see it a lot with either Jordan Peterson or Jonathan Haidt, these kind of people who are intellectual thinkers but then were sort of at stages professors in their own right, educated, but then go out, do speaking, write books, that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's probably the intro that you can
well said.
give to that one.
I think I would definitely put him in the category of what we might think of as a public intellectual, which I think is today we often confuse with a thought leader, whereas what I would call a thought leader is just someone who's really good at self-promotion and is able to get themselves in front of CEOs and TED cameras and on the stages of places like the World Economic Forum. Some have more substance underneath those ideas than others, but very different from the public intellectual. And this is actually, for folks who are interested in exploring that dichotomy or that debate, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the American writer, has written a fair amount about that. I'm sure others have as well, about the decline of the public intellectual and the rise of the thought leader and what that actually means. But putting that aside for the moment, I think we we've been talking about Postman amusing ourselves to death. I think the main point that comes through for me in this book is the fact that even though he wrote it essentially before the age of the internet, or certainly before what we know of as the internet, there were technologies that would become what we think of as the net in development in certain places, in universities and defense departments and things like that in 1985 when he wrote this book. But for all intents and purposes, the medium that he was talking about was television. And one of Postman's main messages in this book is that we focus so much on the content that comes through that we forget that it's not necessarily the content that is changing us or teaching us what truth is, but the actual medium through which we are getting that content. And he cites someone who Nicholas Carr cites. I mentioned Nicholas Carr earlier, the author of The Shallows. Cal Newport cites, a lot of other thinkers today still cite, which is Marshall McLuhan, who had the famous idea that the medium is the message. So again, the important distinction here being that there is a difference between the content that travels across the medium and what the medium itself is. And one of Postman's points, and I'll read a quote here that has really resonated with me in a second, is that, again, and I feel like we can't repeat this enough, which is that there's a difference between what we think of as truth as seen through a television, in his case, or the truth as we see through the internet today, and truth as might be understood through reading a book or having a conversation or getting a telegram. Any number of different mediums can create any number of different experiences of what is real and what is not. And one of the main points that Postman makes in this book that I keep coming back to is that what a lot of people will say today, and a lot of people said, according to Postman in the mid-'80s, was that we've never had more access to information than we do today, so how could it possibly be worse? Or how could it possibly be dangerous? Like, all we're doing is expanding access to information and communication. And this is exactly what we hear from a lot of tech CEOs today as well, which is that we are providing more ways for people to communicate, we are providing more access to information, we're democratizing communication and the internet. All of these things are very seductive ideas, but what Postman points out is that the volume of information, the platform through which it's communicated, the medium through which we receive this input changes how we understand the world. And he says print had a monopoly. This is what made print so significant and so shaping throughout history, and books in particular, for 3 centuries, probably more, is that it wasn't just that we had print, because right now we have more access to print than we've ever had before as a society, but print doesn't have the same monopoly, as he puts it, monopoly on both attention and intellect that it used to. And this is the same thing. Again, I come back to this rhetoric that we hear from tech CEOs who want to avoid regulation and want to be thought of as these messiahs who are saving society by democratizing information. They'll say we've never had more access to information than ever before, which may objectively be true, but that's not the whole story, because how we consume that information, how it gets to us, how it's shared, how it replicates, all of this stuff, the infrastructure behind the content shapes how we understand the world. So let me read one quote here that I think is very relevant. So this means, among other things, that we rarely talk about television only about what is on television, that is, about its content. Its ecology, which includes not only its physical characteristics and symbolic code, but the conditions in which we normally attend to it, is taken for granted, accepted as natural. Television has become, so to speak, the background radiation of the social and intellectual universe, the all but imperceptible residue of the electronic Big Bang of a century past, so familiar and so thoroughly integrated with American culture, but obviously this is beyond America, that we no longer hear its faint hissing in the background or see the flickering gray light. This, in turn, means that its epistemology goes largely unnoticed, and the peekaboo world it has constructed around us no longer seems even strange. The world as given to us through television seems natural, not bizarre. And this, I think, is the fundamental point that resonates with me, is the way we consume the world through the internet today no longer seems strange. It is just taken as that's the way it is. And the point that Postman makes is that this is not the only way to understand the world, but the medium through which we interpret it actually shapes how we understand it. So I could go on for a while, but let me hand it back to you for your thoughts, because I know this book has had a big impact on you.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in midway when you were saying that, I was thinking about what you were saying, and it was such a good point. And I thought to myself, perhaps might need to dedicate a whole podcast just to go through the book. Perhaps that might be something we could do in the future. But yeah, I mean, what you said is very, very poignant, I think, for what's happening at the moment in respect to these big tech companies that are, you know, I feel like they are deferring their inevitable decline in some way, in the way that they are suggesting that they are these communication platforms that are speaking the truth, that are giving people low barrier to entry. But I feel like it's an opioid to the masses in respect, and they are deferring and distracting individuals. And I know Postman talks about that in the book, in the sense of distraction from what the actual truth is, in the actual technology being the medium itself being the distraction, rather than the content itself, and the content somewhat takes precedence, but it's always the medium. There was actually one quote that I wanted to share which had a massive impact on me, and I always talk about not highlighting large chunks of sentences, but I seem to have highlighted the majority of this page. The quote was, "To engage the written word means to follow a line of thought, which requires considerable power of classifying, inference making, and reasoning. It means to uncover lies, confusions, and overgeneralizations, to detect abuses of logic and common sense. It also means to weigh ideas, to compare and contrast assertions, to connect one generalization to another." And this was in reference to a previous quote I made, in the sense of reading and the power of books, where we have come to a stage in our society where we love to overgeneralize everything. We see a news headline and we generalize based on our own preconceptions. And we see someone's tweet and we're like, oh, this is what they must be like as a person, because this is their political affiliation. This is the way they see the world. I'm going to put them in this box and that box. They're a bad person. You know, we spring up tweets by people said 10 years previously when they were just a teen and they didn't know things, and we want to bring you up against them because now they're in a position of power and you want to knock them down off their pedestal. And I'm like, I feel like Postman is saying that the acquisition of knowledge can only come through labor. And I know we talked about this earlier, in the sense of books aren't something to be taken lightly. And perhaps we haven't even talked about this, and I actually wanted to bring it up before, is books aren't easy. To read isn't easy. Like, people often we're talking about generalization, but they overgeneralize the ease of reading. They think, oh yeah, you know, reading's just scattering your eyes across a page and the information flows in. And it's like, nope, that's not how it works. Because if you really are to think and deliberate and pontificate over the information, you have to answer difficult questions about yourself. Because you have to, like Viktor Frankl says in Man's Search for Meaning, is you can't assume that the prison guards are evil if you don't already put yourself in their position and ask whether you do the same thing. What would you do in that same situation? And I feel like it's very similar to these types of books. It's like, what would you do if you were that person and you have to infer yourself as the protagonist, fake protagonist in this case, because there's no real protagonist. And as the reader, I guess you are the protagonist, which is an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah, but that mental exercise is it's difficult. It's challenging. It requires energy and it requires work. And it also requires work just on a more meta level to focus on one thing for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
I think that's such an important point you are making, that just because we choose to focus on something doesn't make that something easy. You can choose to focus on something and then it's still just as hard as it would have been before, even if you have fewer other things distracting you from it. It's obviously true for writing too, but reading is one of those activities where I have to trust that it's going to take me 15, 20, 30 minutes to get into it. I have to trust that the bouncing around feeling of my brain for the first 15, 20 minutes is going to dissipate as the mind quiets and I'm able to focus, because if I don't trust that that's going to happen, I'm never going to get past those first 15, 20 minutes. And so I think that point that just because we make time for it or prioritize it does not make it easy, I think that's so just, it's such a fundamental point underlying everything that we've been talking about today.
Because the questions that I get all the time is like, how do I establish a reading habit? How do I read more? And on the surface level, they're really important questions, because obviously I'd encourage everyone to read. And perhaps this is why book summaries are popular, because it's difficult to read a book from start to finish. But like anything, the more you do it, the better you get at it. Because people say to me, even my family members, are like, how do you read so much? Because it's difficult to sit down there and read a book from start to finish. It's not easy, and it's something I definitely don't take lightly and over-trivialize. But I would also say is you can't come to know yourself first, but also the objective world without reading a lot. I think you can't. I don't think there's any other medium that you can come to know things to that depth that you can get. And the same with writing is like we speak about this all the time, and this might be a good transition into Analogue. But it's like you can't know your thoughts by not writing them down. You know, you have to write down your thoughts in order to know them. And the process of writing is a process of thinking, not writing. So it's somewhat counterintuitive, but it's also necessary. Like you can't get mental clarity without writing it down, and often by hand. It's something that we've been discussing for the last couple of months. For me, inspired by Neil Gaiman, but is something I definitely want to discuss, and you talked about earlier about Analogue and the power of reading by books, print books, but also writing with a fountain pen or a pen of any type, as we seek to digitalize everything, which there is still power in the analog.
Very much so. And I think to your point, before we shift away from Postman, to the quote that you read about a book being able to contain a logical, coherent, long-term, for lack of a better phrase, argument or series of arguments in a way that at least no other medium that we have now can. If you think about that compared to a movie, there's a lot of value in movies and TV shows. We're probably living in a golden age of content in terms of volumes that we have access to, and different types and things that are on demand, and there's value in all of that. But one thing I think about when I try to decide, should I watch a movie, should I read a book, is in a lot of ways, a book gets you more into the mind of not just the author, but the entire scene playing out. If you think about a movie, you have lots of distractions, but you also have just what's on the screen in front of you. So you have to infer what a character is thinking, or you basically have to infer anything that isn't explicitly shown to you or said to you. Whereas in a book, you have everything that's explicitly said or shown, but you also have the thoughts, you have the inner monologue of the narrator, the author. You have your own experience, like you said, of being the pseudo-protagonist as the reader. And I don't think we have invented another medium that can do all of those things while also containing a complex argument, or again, multiple arguments over an extended volume of information. And it's one of those things that, Postman talks a lot about the difference between knowledge or entertainment, and we can consume content for knowledge, or we can consume content for entertainment. And one of the things that he says in Amusing Ourselves to Death is that he doesn't really have a problem with television that is clearly and obviously just to entertain. What he's concerned about is television that presents itself as serious truth or fact or the way things are. And that, in his argument, and I think this is very true, and again, we just have to replace television with the internet or social media or any number of things that we all consider just the way things are today. It's that if we know it's just entertainment, we maintain some control over it, and we recognize that it's not real. But once entertainment becomes our only reality, we think that is truth. We think that is reality. And we only have to look at what politics has become to see how what entertains us becomes also government. It becomes politics. It becomes reality. Consuming information in a way that has an end. And obviously there are more books that I want to read than I can ever possibly read, but at least a book. I finish this book by Neil Postman and then I close it. And that's the end of it. There are no tabs. I can go look up stuff on the internet if I want, but that's the end of it. Or this book that I'm going to mention later on, Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, about her experience in Silicon Valley. The book ends. It's over. And there's something about that I have not really made sense of where it's coming from yet, but that is my craving for analog right now. And as best I can understand, that's why I'm pursuing writing the first draft of this book by hand, as you and I have talked about, because there's something grounding and clarifying, and it forces you to slow down in a way that just becomes completely overwhelming if we do it all electronically. So anyways, I could go on about this for a while, but I'd be curious for your thoughts. And I feel like you should mention too our earlier conversation about handwriting to give folks some context about why we have been moving this direction.
Interestingly enough, I've never really gotten into Kindles. I've always been a hand analog person when it comes to books, because I don't think there's a substitute for it, for actually picking up a book and reading it. I think you can't get distracted, and there's no fooling yourself about what you're actually doing. When you've got a Kindle, sometimes, some you can even scroll the internet, I think. I don't know. I do have one, but I barely use it. It's easier just to put to the side, basically. Reading on your iPad or reading on your phone, I'm like, why even bother? Because you're going to get a notification. You're going to get something's going to distract you. Something's going to come into your mind and being like, oh, well, who was this Neil Postman? And then you type in Neil Postman on Google, and then you're like, oh, that's just the end of it. So that's never really been a thing for me. Plus, I just love... I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between buying books for the sake of accumulating books, but buying books because you love to read them. I just love to have them around me because, similar to, for instance, going into a second-hand shop or like a second-hand music shop, buying a book for me, and it's not the fact that I buy second-hand books because I buy new books, but it's like you see them and it's like you feel them. And you're like, there's knowledge inside them and you can feel that. And I don't know whether it's a sixth sense. I don't know what it is. But similar to when you walk into a bookshop, like you said earlier, it's like you feel that. You can't express that into words sometimes. You just feel it. And you can feel the information around you. You can feel the history around you. And that's why I like having them on display. Some people like putting their books on shelves. I'm like, no, that's not happening. Because you're like, they're not antiquities to the degree that you can just put them to the side. They are things that should be read and used and written on. And I don't fear about writing. I don't feel about highlighting. Like, it doesn't matter to me. It's like there's something to be used for a certain purpose that should be given its due respect. And that's why I try and buy as many as I can hard copy, because in reference to digital, I know we talked about things that last a long period of time. There's been scrolls that have been written on for thousands of years that date back to ancient Egypt that are still surviving today. However, if the internet goes down like it did yesterday or the day before, for a small period of time, what happens to all that information? That doesn't last. It just vanishes. But there's blocks of stone that have been carved for thousands of years that still remain. And I feel like, and I put out this tweet a couple of days ago, a week or two ago, and I said that buying a book is like preserving a part of our civilization. And I truly believe that. I think every time you buy a book, you're preserving a part of our civilization, because you're basically saying this existed. Neil Postman existed. This is proof of who he was and what he wrote about and his ideas. You can't just... A Wikipedia page doesn't do it justice, because a Wikipedia page might not last. But a book, if kept, properly, can last. Especially this type of book, not like the old papyrus type that fades in time. But this will last if not left in damp conditions. If it's dry, it will last. I don't know forever, but it will last a long period of time. And that's what I think about, because I feel like buying a hard copy is like stamp, this happened for our civilization and we can keep on moving forward. But every single time we try and digitalize everything, I almost feel like we're taking a step out of our civilization. And this is why I am starting to write handwritten, and I know you're doing the same. To reference our previous conversation, we've been talking about, writing in the sense of as a way of thinking, but you can also type as quicker than you can write. And in the process of typing, you almost you don't think as much, and you're not as deliberate and precise in what you're trying to say, and you can type much quicker than you can think. And in the process of writing by hand, you can be more clear in your thoughts, and you can have more logical arguments, and I feel like your writing improves. Obviously, I'm not the best judge of my own writing. That's for other people to decide. But I feel like the clarity of my thoughts in the process of writing becomes better through writing by hand. And we've discussed it many times, and I think it's really powerful, that process of writing by hand and anything that's analog. And I'm trying to move everything I can to analog that I can. Obviously, there's some things that I can't. I can't edit a video by hand. Right. I need the software to do that. But there are things that I can do, and I will prioritize that.
To bring this back to the handwriting versus typing discussion, you can't write without creating words and sentences and arguments and paragraphs. You can write without a computer. People did it for pretty much all of the history of the written word.
Longer than we've had
recently.
Computers. Yeah.
Yeah, substantially longer. You can't write without sitting down and doing the work of writing, but you can very much do it without the technology itself. And I constantly find myself thinking that I will start writing when I pay for a Scrivener license, or I get a faster computer, or you can come up with excuses until the end of time. And I feel like the exercise that you're describing is a good way of separating the act, the craft, from everything else that we put around it. But at the end of the day, the question is, are we going to do the work or not? At the end of the day, are we going to prioritize reading because we know it brings us value and fulfillment, or not, even though it's difficult? And even though it means giving up on the email newsletter, the podcast that I really like and get a lot of value out of as well. And obviously we can only answer these questions ourselves. Nobody else can answer them for us. And I feel like life in a lot of ways is just asking that question every single day and hoping we answer in the affirmative more often than not. But it is a constant struggle, and I feel like we find ourselves doing these things all the time, and it is a perpetual game of negotiation with ourselves, I think.
Yeah, and it's the case that you want to be in the affirmative most of the period of time, but it's not even that the case. It's even to the sense you want to be on the trajectory of answering that question every single day. It's like, is that like your North Star in a respect? It's like, are you continually, perpetually working towards a state where you are creating more than you are consuming? And that's
a helpful
what
way
I
to think about it, because that allows you to forgive yourself and not get totally off track if you fall short one day, if you know you're on the right trajectory. Yeah, definitely, because there might be a day, and I have those days sometimes where, I've put in some time to either write or create a YouTube video or, whatever it might be, for content creation, and then I found myself even, reading too much perhaps, when I'm not really getting that much value. I'm just doing it because it's distracting me, because it can be a distraction as well. I've talked about this with Nick Velasquez, who came on the podcast, and we were talking about non-fiction books, and reading non-fiction is a way of thinking that you're doing the work. When you read a business book, you're reading a business book because it makes you feel like you're doing it, but you're not doing it. You're just reading what someone else did, and it's taken time away. Same thing with self-improvement.
Exactly the same concept. And everyone, and it's a daily thing, because you don't just wake up one day and you be like, I've got the formula. No matter what anyone says, whatever fake guru tells you, they don't have the formula, and you don't have the formula. No one has the formula. It's a daily struggle, and you have to wake up every day with that in mind. And I feel like you'll be in a better place if you have that in the back of your mind. In the forefront of your mind is no one has the right answer for you. Only you have the right answer for yourself, and that requires you to continually answer that question every single day.
Yes, well said. And even if they did have the formula, which they don't, just reading the formula wouldn't achieve anything on its own. You would still have to then implement it. So they don't have the formula, and even if they did, that alone would not be sufficient. You still have to show up and do the work. Most days, not every day. Most days.
Most days, definitely most days, and like you said, more days than not, which is very important. And you're writing your manuscript by hand. How have you found the process of doing so, and has it changed your approach to researching, and how have you found the clarity of your thoughts and your arguments as a result?
So the answer is that it's still a work in progress. We'll see how much I end up writing by hand by the time I get to the end of this project. But so far I've written I was going to say the first chapter, but the first chapter has turned into many chapters. And the short answer is that it has been enormously helpful, because out of writing this first part by hand, I have realized that I need to overhaul the entire structure of the book. And would I have come to that conclusion if I had been typing it out? It's possible. I don't really know. But I suspect the clarity that I got by writing it would have been buried under all sorts of other fragments of sentences and fragments of thoughts or distractions or tabs that I would have opened. And so, just to be very concrete about it, what I've been doing is I have all of the notes from books that I have read as part of this book. I have all of the articles that I'm referencing saved as PDFs, so they are static in one place, and they're not flashing at me, and I can't really click on the links very easily. And I have all of my other notes and outlines in Evernote in front of me. But when I'm actually doing the writing is in a, print notebook, the invisible notebook that I'm holding in my hands here. And that process has been enormously frustrating at times, because even though I'm writing more slowly, I still want to go back and move some things around or add in a few sentences here when I wrote it down there and realize that I actually should have said that earlier. And there's only so many asterisks and carets and arrows that I can put in this draft before it becomes completely unreadable and arguably not very useful. But I feel like the fact that has been so frustrating, and the fact that I need to put in brackets TK lookup stats for this, as opposed to getting to that point and then opening a new tab and then being gone for the rest of the day in the internet, is the frustrations are sort of the point. And I know without a doubt that what you have said before, and which has really stuck with me since you said it in our conversation last summer, that you type faster than you can think, that is undoubtedly true for me. And by forcing me to slow down and write this first draft, I feel like I have a much better idea of the work isn't done. I still have probably 30 drafts to do before I'll even be able to send off the book proposal, but I have a much more solid understanding of what I'm trying to say. And to me, that says that the experiment is a success. I probably would have had thousands more words written and been by some measures further ahead in submitting the book proposal, but I'm pretty sure that what would be in there would be less substantively worthwhile than what I have now. And we'll see. I mean, the experiment will continue. I don't know if I'll be able to write the whole book by hand. Maybe I just use it at the beginning and then switch to typing once I have a better idea of what I'm going to be saying. One of the things that you'd suggested in a previous conversation was, when we were talking about trying to balance research and writing, was maybe do 2 days of research, 1 day of writing. And I've on and off, I've been trying that, and I think that'll be what I pursue going forward. So maybe it's 2 days in front of the computer and in front of print books, researching, note-taking, 1 day in front of the old-fashioned paper notebook writing, and then that cycle repeats. We'll see what happens. But so far, I think the experiment that you and I have been talking about has been pretty successful and pretty clear that something... I don't know if something is lost when we only write electronically, but there's definitely something to be gained by writing by hand, especially today.
Yeah, so that's a really good way to put it that you just did. You said there's nothing to be lost, but there's so much to be gained. And I think that's really true when it says to doing anything analog. It's like, yes, you can read a book on your iPad or your computer or your Kindle. That's good. And there's obviously things to learn, but there's so much to be gained about having the physical copy. And the same when writing. It's like, yes, you can write an article on your computer and it can be a great article, but it could be better if you did it by hand. So there's unlimited upside, I feel like, by doing anything that way, which is really interesting to think about. And, you know, one of the things that we've discussed and I've been discussing with authors as well on the podcast is, you know, just writing in general. Because the thing that I get asked all the time is, when are you going to write a book and what is it going to be about? And I'm like, it's probably not going to be a non-fiction book. It's just the way I see it is, I don't have anything inside me that's burning inside me that I'm wishing to share in the non-fiction space. I'm like, if I was to do it, I know I'd only do it just because I feel like I'm obliged to. And that you should, in my mind, and this is something I've said to myself, you should never do anything just because you feel obliged to do it. Do it either because you believe it's the right thing to do, or do it because you think it's going to give people value. Don't do it because you feel like you're obliged to do it. And that's been my approach to content creation, whether it be through my channels or whatever it might be. It's like, are you doing it because you want to do it, or are you doing it because you feel like some mysterious force out there is obliging you to do it? It's like, that never ends up, anything that I've done that I feel like I'm obliged to do it, I'm either resentful for having done it, or it just never is as good. So I just try and avoid that at all costs. And
good way to make yourself miserable for a long, extended period of time.
And it might make you feel good in the short term, but this goes back to our previous point, is you want to elongate contentment in the long term rather than short term satisfaction, because anything gained through short term is very rarely anything that you wish to hold on to the long term. So that's why everything for me, I feel like, is through that medium of that range of time, really. I always think, what would 50-year-old version of me think about this? Would he be happy about it? Would he not be happy about it? And this is assuming that I get to 50. I might not get to 50, but it's just the mindset. I feel like that's really important, because I want to continue to be creative and creating content, or just creating in general, whatever that medium that is in, for the rest of my life. So why should I focus on just whatever form of creation it is and now for the next 6 months? It's irrelevant to a degree, really, when you think about it.
A related question: what would 50-year-old you care about? Fill in the blank. What you're doing right now, what you're doing tonight. Would 50-year-old you care that you spent 12 hours scrolling through social media? Probably not. That time basically doesn't exist to 50-year-old you, but having a meaningful conversation, reading a meaningful book, spending time with family, like all of these things that, again, risk becoming very cliche, the 50-year-old versions of ourselves are going to be much more, I think, appreciative that we spent the time in that way than the meaningless stuff that too easily fills our entire days.
Yeah, a 50-year-old version of me would much rather call my granddad or my grandma, who are in their mid-80s, because chances are they definitely won't be around. So yeah, that's what a 50-year-old version of me would definitely think, rather than
said.
Have the watch whatever, insert the blank. So that's definitely something that I think about a lot. And I don't know whether this is something that I think about all the time, is does everyone think like this? Are we overthinking things? Because I think there's a degree of overthinking, and this is something I question all the time. But
I'm sure we are. I'm not going to choose
another way. Is that a bad thing?
But
is that a bad thing?
Knows?
That's just something I think about all the time. It's funny, you're thinking about your overthinking. It's like never ending.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously no answer to that question. Yeah, and I feel like just asking the question is a pretty healthy exercise in itself. But I'm sure we are. I'm sure on all of these things we're overthinking it. But I don't know. I think there's value to be gained in that as well. And like you were mentioning earlier in a different context, it's all trial and error. I feel like that's the best we can do is try something, try to learn from it, try to be aware of it, and then try to do better the next time, whatever better may be. But as to the question of whether we're overthinking some of this stuff, I have to imagine that we are. But I find it thoroughly enjoying and rewarding to overthink it. So just going to lean into it.
Yeah, I think the justification in my own mind is if it produces a positive output or an outcome, or what I perceive to be a positive outcome, then I don't deem it to be overthinking. If the overthinking turns somewhat sour and negative, then I believe it to be overthinking, because I think overthinking can be malicious to yourself. But if it is thinking that produces a positive outcome, then it's not overthinking. That's the way I tend to justify it to myself. I think it'll just be good to talk about some books, because we're a books podcast and we both love to read, and we've been harping on to everyone listening about why everyone should read. So I think if we don't throw some recommendations,
walk here.
Yeah, exactly. So do you wanna throw some, our way, Adam?
Let me start with a few nonfiction ones, and then we can talk about those, and then maybe close with a few fiction recommendations. One of the things that you and I have talked about is the value of reading fiction, and for some people that's very obvious, but I know for me, I spent years thinking that fiction was just leisure, and that the real work, the real knowledge, the real effort, the return on investment came from just reading nonfiction. And I have been completely reworking that over the past couple of years as I've tried to read more fiction and just be exposed to different perspectives, to grow a sense of empathy and understanding of the world. And I've just, looking back on the way I approach it, I understand where that aversion to reading novels came from, but I also see just how misguided it was and how much good literary education I missed out on by just avoiding, probably 2/3 of the books that have ever been written for a good portion of my 20s and early 30s. So anyways, having said that, why don't I actually start with the fiction book? So one that I read a few months ago is by Kim Stanley Robinson, The Ministry for the Future. And I'm reading another one of his books right now. He's a very acclaimed science fiction writer, and has, from the way I understand it, there's a relatively new genre. I don't know if it's that new, but it's becoming more prominent now, of what is known as cli-fi, or climate fiction, which is science fiction that tries to understand the world through the lens of climate change. So obviously that's a lot of looking ahead at, 2050, year 2150, 2300, some point in the future, and looking at different worlds that have impacted by climate change as a way of recognizing what exactly we're doing to the planet right now. And this book, The Ministry for the Future, long story short, it is about a new UN agency that is created I think it's created before, but it's a new UN agency called the Ministry for the Future, to try to give future generations a voice in international diplomacy and international negotiations. And it's all about how does society deal with the consequences of a massive heat wave that kills millions of people, that then prompts some countries to start undertaking geoengineering efforts like cloud seeding and things like that without international agreement. And how does the international community respond, and what do central banks do as a way of wresting control from financial institutions that are funding carbon intensive industries. And it's a book that at times that it was just a little bit over my head, although I think that's probably a good thing in a book, to feel like there's more going on than you're aware of or you're able to follow. But it's just a really eye-opening way to think about not just what the world might look like in 50, 100, 150 years, but also how might humanity as we understand it today get its act together and respond. And the short answer is that it's a lot of what we've been talking about. It's a lot of trial and error, but I would definitely recommend this book, The Ministry for the Future. The other fiction book that I read recently is another somewhat dystopian, somewhat climate-oriented book called The Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And this is a book, I think she wrote it in 1993. It's like eerily prescient. It's about a world, and again, written like we knew about climate change in the early 90s, but it wasn't the topic of conversation that it is today. And writing in the early 90s, she imagines a world, and it's focused on the US, but so she imagines an America that is ravaged by the effects of climate change, set in 2020, which is super creepy as well.
That's
but she
creepy.
also looks at the impact of rampant privatization, and the world she describes is one in which governments have basically ceased to function except for the elite, and the only people who can afford what we like to think of today as public services, fire protection, police protection, not to mention just, general public safety, access to electricity, the internet, things that we should be able to think of as public goods have been privatized. And a lot of people think of this book as a warning about climate change, but I think of it as a warning of climate change as well as the starving and defunding and destruction of governments and the idea of public good. There's one scene, and I won't spoil too much of it, that's the Parable of the Sower, and then there's Parable of the Talents is the sequel, and I would definitely recommend both of these books, although not when you're feeling a little bit eerie or uncomfortable about the trajectory of modern society. Read it when you're feeling a little bit more optimistic. It'll bring you right down. But one of the things she describes in the book is if you are not wealthy and you can't afford to build a private security system around your home, you can go live in a city that is run by a corporation. And these cities are safe, they're clean, you have access to water, all of the basics that we think, rightfully so, that governments should provide. But the only place the average person can find it in these stories is in a city that is wholly run by a corporation. So while people think of this book as entirely about climate change, and it is very much about that, it's also about what happens if we stop investing in government and making government functional and effective and responsive to people, and instead outsource and privatize everything and leave it in the hands of corporations. So Parable of the Sower and The Ministry for the Future are my two novels that I would recommend to folks. So I'll hand it over to you for if you want to recommend some fiction before we go back to
that's powerful,
to
that
nonfiction.
last bit. That's like, because I've been thinking and reading a lot about that topic, and the fact that these big companies and corporations are like countries because they are global and they have more power really than some governments to dictate change and control the spread of information. So yeah, definitely agree. I've been reading a lot of Dostoevsky, so it seems like we're just recommending books that are utterly depressing, but I feel like in
Sorry,
doing
everyone.
so, yeah, I know. No romance here. It's Dostoevsky for me. So Notes from the Underground and Devils. For me, it's like what he does, Dostoevsky, so well is, and what I like is, when I read fiction, I just don't want something that's too unbelievable that I can't consider it to be reality. I want to find some sort of pseudo protagonist within it, because I feel like that's where the value comes from. And this is where perhaps I was slightly naive when I took a break from fiction, in the sense that non-fiction can teach you stuff, but fiction can do it in the same way, in the sense of how you think about yourself and what you can think of others. And what he does so beautifully in there is he really questions himself as an individual. This is specifically in Notes from the Underground. He is so self-critical of himself as a person that is... he calls himself like a feeble, cruel man. And he's like, what is this? How can I live with this? How can I live with myself? How can others come to respect me? Written in the early 1900s in Russia, which is quite possibly one of the most depressing periods in history. Early 1900s Russia. I went to a V&A exhibition. You'll know the V&A now because you lived in London. They had an exhibition on Russia during the Russian Revolution, and we went as a family because with this pre-COVID, obviously, this is a couple of years ago now, and we left just like, I think we all took a deep breath when we left, because I studied Russia and I studied the Russian Revolution in depth. Also the under Lenin, specifically in the early 1920s. And you can't come to know what it was like to live there unless you really read about it in depth. And we saw photos, we saw some video, and we were like, wow, that is just so depressing. But it's so uplifting because you're like, this is what we can achieve if things are put into place. Anyway, for the book himself, so eloquently put, but similar to yours, don't read if you're currently not in the best place, because it will take you down a hole probably that's best place for when you're perhaps have some sort of mental clarity and optimism, but much needed reading. And I think, just to touch upon this point, Adam, I think it's really important that we've talked about how difficult reading is, but I would also like to talk about how you need to challenge yourself. And this was a YouTube video I was going to make recently because I had this idea, and how you need to read challenging books. And life's difficult, and you need to arm yourself with information and knowledge that will aid you in that. But that knowledge is difficult to read at first, and that's why you need to actively seek it. So just wanted to touch upon that point, because it's not depressing for the sake of it. It's there to give you resilience. Right. Similar to how any type of medication or vaccine or whatever it might be gives you a small bit of whatever that disease is to a degree. It's like that's what you need to do in small increments so that you become weathered to that. So anyway, non-fiction.
History is full of examples of what happens when we pretend that what's right in front of us is not happening, or we don't acknowledge what is hiding in plain sight. Yes. And an inoculation is a great way to think about it. It's like a inoculation against apathy or something like that. I don't know. The metaphor
apathy
works.
Yeah, definitely. I think apathy, definitely, but also
complacency.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the right word, but it's almost like it's not the right thing to do. Like it, like inside of you, like I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to continue to do it because it's the easy thing to do.
Right. Like every time we pull to refresh.
Yes. Exactly. Do you want to talk about some non-fiction?
Some non-fiction, yeah. So I could go on for a while here, and I've mentioned a couple of the books. The Shallows, we've obviously talked about amusing ourselves to death. This book that I held up, Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener. She's a New Yorker writer who, I think it came out I think it's a 2020 book, but she writes for the New Yorker now, but before she was a journalist, she was working in Silicon Valley, I think like early 20-teens, something like that. And this is a book about her experience there, and it's just an absolutely devastating portrait of not just Silicon Valley and not just the people who make up and lead the tech companies that control so much of our politics, our public discussion, our economies today. But she completely eviscerates the Messiah complex that a lot of tech founders, and then of course the media and all of the other players that give the tech founders this Messiah-like platform. And she looks at how just completely clueless an entire industry can be, and so detached from reality when it's just pumped full of venture capitalist dollars and composed entirely of people who, for the most part come from really privileged backgrounds, mostly white, mostly just hire friends who they went to college with. And what happens when you put these people who in most cases are not malicious, they're well-intentioned like most people, but they are not ready to be dictating the outcomes of national elections at the very least, let alone impacting the lives of so many people. So it's just a really devastating and self-aware portrait of Silicon Valley. I think she does a good job admitting her own and recognizing her own ways that she, and I certainly felt this in myself as well, by extension me, the reader, are complacent in choosing to order an Uber instead of going out and hiring a taxi or ordering food on Deliveroo instead of going to the local restaurant down the street and just paying for that same meal without giving the cut to the tech company, and all the ways we choose convenience over people, and all the ways we choose the technology solutions promised to us in the future instead of confronting the real issues that are in front of us right now.
Yeah.
And, one thing that she mentions, which is not the point of the book, but I want to read this one section because it's very relevant to what we've been talking about. So she writes, and this is toward the end of her time in the Valley, as they say, and before she moved to San Francisco, she was working at a literary agency, I think. And so she comes from a literary background. She's obviously a journalist as well. And she writes as she's looking for something to read while she's in this world of Silicon Valley and big tech. She writes, contemporary literature offered no respite. I would find prose cluttered with data points, tenuous historical connections, details so finely tuned it could only have been extracted from a feverish night of search engine queries. Aphorisms were in, authors were wired. I would pick up books that had been heavily documented on social media, only to find that the books themselves had a curatorial effect. Beautiful descriptions of little substance arranged in elegant vignettes. Then later down the page she says, oh, I would think, turning the page, this author is addicted to the internet too. And it was just, that passage just made me think, like, we've been talking about the value of books and writing and analog in this world, and how much is the internet impacting the very books that we read and write. Like, how much is the medium of the internet, and before it television, to think about Postman, how much of that is changing the way books are written? Are we writing shorter books? Are we writing books that are more all over the place? And I obviously don't have the answer to that, but I'd never really recognized the fact that it's not just a one-way thing. It's not like books are the same as they've always been, but we, the reader, are changing because we're living in an internet age, but also the books themselves, the authors themselves, are changing how they see and understand the world because of the internet in some sort of vicious, unknowable cycle. So I have a bunch of other books written down, but I'm not going to go any beyond that, because I think I'll just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, tease them, Adam.
Yeah.
Is the fact that, on reference to that point, is I obviously read a lot, but I read a lot of books like Postman's that have been out in the 80s, or books that have been around for some time now. Mm-hmm. And there is a definite correlation I find between internet people who write books and people who are pre-internet. And I think I know we've been talking about people who write with feeling like they have the answer. Which is, I think, a main selling point of the internet, is you have to sell yourself as if you have the answer. And I think people write now with the view that they have an answer, rather than writing with really good questions. Whereas I feel like the people of the past wrote because they had questions, and they wrote with the viewpoint of trying to answer these questions that perhaps don't have answers, but in the process of finding the answer, they bring up interesting points. Whereas at the moment, it's like, I have the answer, here's my view. That's it. End of book. And it's like, well,
there's a lot to that.
It's like, there's no value in that. As the reader, you're like, okay, I have one person's perspective, but it's like, well, great. What now? Thanks.
Right.
Insert Jay Shetty. I'm like, great, thanks. Thanks for your 2 cents on breathing techniques, but it's like, well, how's that going to help me as an individual? Beyond the breathing techniques, obviously. So yeah, no, I couldn't second that point even more, and I that's just given me a thinking point to think about how versus old books. I think it's an interesting point, and yeah, I look forward to reading that. Sounds like a really interesting book. One of them for me, it's one of my favorite authors at the moment, and slowly becoming my favorite author is Will Storr. Not because he's now a friend of mine, apparently, but I feel like his writing, he is very unsocial media. He's very what I say quintessentially, he's a writer first and foremost, a journalist. One of his books he wrote before The Science of Storytelling and Selfie was The Heretics, about individuals who stand against the social norms to challenge them. And he talks about the cognitive biases that these heretics have, and some of the outlandish things that they do and propagate in the name of science or otherwise. And the very interesting thing about the book is he gives really interesting examples like James Randi, and these people that are skeptics to the core. And in the book, what I love about it is he has this internal monologue about himself and his own experience. And he's like, I used to think this, and I used to think everyone who was, he talks about homeopathy. And he was like, everyone who's into homeopathy is just kidding themselves, and they're just pseudoscience, and it's just blah, 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 it doesn't make sense. Science wins, you have to test it, all that kind of stuff. But then in his exploration, then he meets someone in homeopathy, and it's like, well, it gives people benefit. And then he talks about, I don't think I'm ruining it, but then he talks about placebo. And he says, well, if a placebo works, what difference does it make if it actually helps them? Surely it's the help that matters rather than whether it's scientifically valid. And then he has this monologue about, well, that sort of throws my world out of proportion. I thought that everyone who's against science is evil, and they're these Bible bashing people that just want this to stop science, and creationism is the way. And what I took from the book is, it's like, and this is why I think he's such a great writer, it's questioning. He's questioning himself in the process of writing the book. Mm-hmm. He's like, he's having this internal monologue, and as the pseudo protagonist, as the reader, you're like, wait, do I think about these things? Do I have unconscious biases? How do I think about these things? Do I have this point of view merely because it's cultural, merely because I think I am more intellectual than these type of people? Then flat earthers, for instance, is one group of people that I'm like, why flat earthers? Why are you wasting your life on this? Which I still agree. But it's like, what possesses them to think in such a way? What possesses someone to think in that way? Which I think is a really powerful book, and I recommend everyone to read all of his books, but definitely that one, because I think it's so powerful. I think it's so powerful as the reader to ask yourself questions like he does throughout that book. So that'll be one. I definitely think in reference to our conversation, Amusing Ourselves to Death is a great one. But I want to talk about specifically a book that I had on, which was Violet Moller. Which is a more of a history book, and interestingly enough, Adam, I think I've rekindled my love of history. I've always been a big history fan. History fan sounds so weird. I'm not a fan of history. I love reading history. So it just sounds so trivial when you say you're a fan of history. You're like, it just doesn't sound right.
Pro history.
I'm a pro history. I am pro talking about history, let's say it that way, and reading about it, because I think it's very relevant. And one of my favorite eras is the Ottoman Empire, Byzantine, and in this book it's called The Map of Knowledge, and I think it extends beyond history, because she talks about how knowledge formed in the East, and how it was in Greek originally, and then it moved over to the Arab world, and then moved back to what we determine now to be Western thought. So she talks about an idea, and the book talks about 7 cities, starting off in Alexandria, and then Baghdad, and then it talks about Cordoba in Spain, Toledo in Spain, and then goes into 3 cities in Italy, which is Salerno, Palermo, and Venice. And she talks about how these cities were these cultural and centers of knowledge, and how their knowledge really, spread throughout time. And it's actually chronological, so it goes through Baghdad, and then it talks about how it goes to each one of these cities from 500 to 1500. What I love about this book was the fact that she talks about the Latinization of information. So what we in Western Enlightenment, and I'm using the royal we here, is how Western Enlightenment thinkers and people in the West today think of themselves with this technology as being the purveyors of this information. It is we who created this information, we are the ones who had it. And then everyone in the East is all these people that live in tribes, and they're so backward because, they live in these kind of conditions because they're not as advanced as we are. And in this book, she basically talks about, in reference to Spain, about how all this information was taken from Greek and Arab thinkers, but in the translation, they wiped out the names and Latinized their names. So when people that were in Spain or Europe read these works, they thought they were from people from like them. Thought they were from Latin origin, but they're actually Arabic. And I feel like this pervades into this notion at the moment where it's the Western have the information and the East don't, whereas actually the East had the information first, and there was just in the process of translating the work, it made it seem like it was actually a Western Enlightenment way of thinking, where all this information, whether it be algebra, whether it be science, astronomy, astrology, was all philosophy, was all centered really originally in the Greek world and Rome, and then moved over to the Arabian world and then transferred its way in there. And as someone who loves knowledge, loves to learn, there is no better book in my mind, because it just illuminates you to the fact of how narrow-minded people are, and how information spreads, and how critical it is to preserve that, which is why, coming full circle, you need to buy books and read them, because when you read a book like this, you realize how important it is, because if it wasn't for the books that these books talk about, we wouldn't know or have the books that we have now, if that makes sense. So it's important to respect that and understand that, and that's what this book does. This is why I think it's really a must read for me. I have no other way to put it, really.
Yeah, no, it sounds excellent. I'm gonna make that a priority, and it makes me think, as you're describing it, about, like, obviously the specific topic is knowledge or information, and how it was co-opted or appropriated and westernized throughout history. But if you zoom out a little bit from that, it seems like, again, without having read the book yet, it seems like that is just another way of saying it wasn't just knowledge. Obviously, it was people, it was cultures, it was traditions. It was a way of seeing all of history through the lens of knowledge. At least that's how it sort of comes across, because it's obviously not just the information that was westernized and appropriated, but entire peoples and communities and societies as well, which is obviously just as relevant today as perhaps at any point in history. Definitely.
Anyway, Adam, pleasure to have you back on. It was a great conversation. We covered many different points. This is a first for this podcast with this length, and I definitely look forward to do it again in the future. Just some closing things. Where's the best place that anyone listening to this can find you to know about your book, Reframe the Day, or to subscribe to your mailing list, which you're due to restart soon?
Yeah, so such a pleasure to be on again and to have this conversation. And I feel like I wasn't sure when we started whether we would be, like, by the end just like exhausted and done with things to talk about, but I feel like we have a bunch of different threads that are now hanging open to be revisited on the next one.
Definitely.
So best place to find me is at my website, adaml.blog, adaml.blog. You can sign up for the old / soon to be new newsletter, which I am going to restart. And that is a mix of technology, culture, media, politics, writing, reading, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about in that newsletter. You can find out more about this book that we've been dancing around a little bit throughout this conversation as it becomes available. And you can find me on some social media platforms, but I never check them, so there won't be much for you to read there. I guess you can see what I was posting 8 months ago or something like that.
I did tag you on a post on a story to say that I've done this, but I'm like, he's not going to see this.
I appreciate that. I will never know it except that you mentioned it. But yeah, my website, adaml.blog, is the place to find out about me and my book, Reframe the Day, Embracing the Craft of Life One Day at a Time, and which, as we discussed, has been out for more than a year. But for people who buy it, just as when it first came out, all of the profits from book sales go to the COVID-19 response efforts of the organization Direct Relief, not to me. So your money is going to a good cause, as well as hopefully getting some good content and ideas from it. So adaml.blog is the site, and thanks again, this has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.